Public speaking guys, Mr. Kim here. Man, it is really strange teaching this lesson without actually being in the room with everyone. I was really hoping we'd be back in school by now because I really like doing this lesson in person. But what can we do? I hope everyone is safe and healthy and happy, and I also hope that I get to see you guys in person before the year's over. We'll have to see. Anyways, I thought we should start today's lesson by doing a quote unquote do now. Yes, I'm aware that we can't actually do this together, but bear with me here. So I have posed a statement. I'm going to read it aloud to you, and then I want to ask you to consider what is wrong with this statement. All right, so here we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Mr. Kim, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about blah, 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 that part doesn't really matter. To begin, blank is important because, now, what's wrong with this statement? What's wrong with what I've written here? A couple of you might be thinking about it. If you need more time, obviously pause now. But some of you might be thinking, well, it's not bad per se. Might be a little boring, though. And yes, that is the entire point. This is functional, this is fine, but it's kind of boring. So today, we're going to talk about opening a speech. Now, I apologize talking about this, because I'm sure some of you, heck, all of you, are exhausted from writing my essay recently for English and really don't want to hear about it, but I do have to make the connection and comparison. Opening a speech is very similar conceptually to starting an essay, but there is a key difference. Obviously, in essays, you have to be much more formal, you have to follow certain conventions, and there are very limited things you can do, whereas when you start a speech, you have to remember that you're talking to an audience in real time. So what you say can, one, be adjusted as you do it, and two, it can be tailored to suit your needs, again, in real time. So, for example, when you write an essay and you start it however you want to start it, ideally with some of the techniques we covered in class, obviously, but when you have an essay, when you start it, obviously, you can't change what the introduction of the essay looks like after you submit your final copy of the essay. But in a speech, you could try something one way when you open a speech, and if you're observing the audience and you realize, oh, they're not responding to this as well, then you might decide, maybe let's just keep things simple, or maybe let's try something else. It really just depends. But reading the audience reaction is very, very important when you open a speech. Some of it you can definitely plan. Other parts you will have to adjust on the fly, which leads me to my second point. Oftentimes when you start a speech, it is helpful to think, you know what, I'm getting too into what I'm doing here. Sometimes a speech doesn't have to be thought of as a speech. Sometimes it can be thought of as a conversation between you and a lot of different people. And in all honesty, some of the best speeches I've ever heard don't sound like speeches. They sound like conversations that are admittedly a little one-sided, but I feel like if I wanted to speak, or if there was an opportunity, I could speak. Sometimes that's the best kind of presentation. Now, obviously, the core functionality of a speech opening is to grab the attention of your audience by engaging their interests. We've talked about audiences before in class, and these techniques I'm going to cover today do vary based on the kind of people in your audience. Sometimes you'll know about your audience ahead of time. You'll know what kind of people they are. Maybe the people in your audience are friends you know, and you know what they will respond to. But unfortunately, opening a speech is kind of a guessing game, more or less. And it's very important to understand how significant an opening is because, like I said, one of the pros about opening a speech versus writing an essay introduction is you can gauge reactions in real time. But if you do this poorly, sometimes it can go really, really badly because, unfortunately, if you start a speech badly, it has the potential to control the energy and attentiveness for the rest of the speech. So no pressure, it is important, but you can definitely do things and use certain techniques to make sure, or at the very least, lessen the possibility of your opening not going well. All right, but let's get into the actual techniques because they're the most important parts of what we're doing today. So first things first, one of my favorite techniques. It's a little impractical, I grant you, in some applications, but one of my favorite techniques is visuality, and I'll explain. I'll demonstrate with an example. It's a little difficult to do here, I grant you. Okay, let's say I'm giving a speech, and pretend for a second I'm not at my computer recording this in my room. Let's say I'm on a stage and you guys are in the audience, and I don't know if you guys can still see me. Yes, you can still see me. Let's say I enter in from off screen and I get to my podium and I look at my thing, and you know what? I'm just going to toss it over my shoulder and just tell you, I don't need this, guys. Wow, I landed that right in the laundry basket. That was quite something. All right, so, or on a flip side, let's say I do this. Let's say my speech is on a piece of paper. Let's say I walk in, I go over to my podium, and I'm like, you know what? I don't need this. Now, some of you guys might be thinking, well, that it's kind of hard to gauge based on, what I'm doing in my room in front of a camera, but I bring these up because I've seen both these techniques used before, actually, and I've seen them work to some degree of effectiveness. In high school, and in all honesty, in my high school, we really didn't care who was in charge of the student council or body, but we obviously had assemblies for people who wanted to become officers or have some sort of leading role in the student council. And in my school, we had speeches. We'd all go to the auditorium, they get up on their stages. I know at South Amboy we did that in the cafeteria this year, and I'm assuming previous years. But I remember there were like 4 or 5 people running to be the sophomore class student president. And the other 4, they were pretty straightforward and straight-laced and, got to the point. And then this one guy, we thought it was really weird because he was kind of a slacker. It was clear he didn't really care about doing it. He really wanted it for the popularity. Because in my school, while it wasn't really important, it was it's hard to explain. In any case, and I will never forget this. I remember he walked up to the podium and he stopped for a second. He looked at his speech and he tore it up and he announced at the top of his voice, "I don't need this." And we all thought it was hysterical. We all laughed and we were clapping. And frankly, one, we were really interested in what he had to say, and 2, I know several people voted for him just because he made us laugh. That's how boring the other speeches were. Now, ultimately, he didn't win because enough of us realized, well, you know what? He didn't actually say anything important, but it was funny, so we liked him. But think about it. This guy, he got, I think, like, second or third most amount of votes. Now, based on just for the fact that he made us laugh and he started off with a really memorable opening, that's not nothing. That's something to consider. And frankly, if he had something more important to say, we probably would have voted him class president. Another thing we should consider is having visual aids that are inherently interesting. So we've talked about visual aids in this class, mostly with slides, sometimes props, and we've touched upon how having really effective props can really enhance your presentation. Like, for example, if I was at a charity event for animal rights, or I was Save the Wetlands type thing, there's a difference between having a slide with bullets and at the same time having a picture of one of the animals in the wetlands or endangered animals, or frankly having an animal on stage to show everyone. It makes things more interesting and engaging, but you have to remember, we're talking about openings here. Whatever visual aid you use has to be captivating. You don't want to start a visual aid, or rather, you don't want to use a visual aid to start a speech and make it something boring, because as much as visual aids and visuality can work when you start a speech, they can also really, really hurt you. They generally set the tone for what you're going to show us or tell us. Of the two, using interesting visual aids or physicality, I think physicality is more, how do I put this? It has the potential to be either really, really good or pointless. You want to be careful about that. All right, now this one I actually mentioned in some degree in English for both the seniors and juniors. If you guys remember, I talked about personal language rhetoric. Now, directives in a speech are similar, and they function more or less like this. Let's say I'm giving a speech right now. Let's say I'm giving a speech about uh, let's say I'm giving a speech about what am I giving a speech about? What am I giving a speech about? Let's say I'm giving a speech about smoking and why we should stop smoking. This is hypothetical. So in order to start my speech, I might say something like, "Picture this," or "Imagine this," or I might tell you, "Close your eyes for a second," or I might say, "Reach under your chair and pull out what's beneath." These are directives. I am physically telling you to do something. That is a great way to start a speech because it helps your audience feel included in the process you have as a speech deliverer. You can definitely work it to different levels. There is a difference between using a physical directive or a guided mental exercise directive. Guided mental exercise directives work more with imagine this or picture this. Let's say for a second I said, picture this. What if there was a world where people didn't smoke at all? And then you in your head start to think about that. You're like, all right, even if you're engaging it from the get go, or you're like, all right, I'll humor this guy or whatever. And you're like, okay, I'm picturing a world without you actually realizing this. By you following the steps I give you, assuming you're a courteous and conscientious audience member, you are already attached to what I'm saying, even if it's only monotonous. This is a very effective way to start a speech. And frankly, sometimes your openings, if you're doing directives, don't actually have to be related to your speech. It helps if they are, and I'll touch upon that a little later today. But another way to make this really, really work could be just making your audience do something physically to feel more alive. I don't know if you've done this in any lessons before with other teachers. You might see this in college if you intend on going to college. In any case, one thing that I've seen work really, really well with some lessons, and this works better with smaller groups rather than larger groups, is a professor will say something like, "All right, let's start today, and let's just shake ourselves out. Let's do a little stretch." So we'll all get up, and they'll guide us in sort of stretching, or like, I don't want to say jumping jacks because jumping jacks is sort of speech, but like shake out your face or like wiggle your hands or something, or stand up and stretch as much as you can. Directives are very, very effective. It helps your audience feel more active, even if all they're doing is sitting in their seats and just thinking about what you're telling them to think about. It could be vocal. You could tell them to say something and maybe feel the gist of a word or an idea you want to say. You could have them turn to other people and talk or something. It really depends on you, but directives, very effective. Okay. Volume is an excellent opening technique, although I might hesitate to call it a technique because, as opposed to the last two that I discussed, volume can require you to do very little and at the same time a great deal. So I'll put it this way. See whether or not you realized I just used volume as a potential public speaking technique. Silence is one of the best and frankly one of the most underused techniques in public speaking, and especially in openings, because one thing that public speakers fear is an awkward silence, a blank silence. It's particularly devastating when you don't know what to say or if you're panicking. I'll give you an example. When I was a student teacher, one of the things I had to do, actually, forget that. Before I was a student teacher, This was at this point, man, through 5 years ago. My God, yeah, 5 years ago. So in any case, I remember I had to teach a lesson in front of a class, and before I was a teacher, I remember one of the things I hated doing was planning out lessons to the minute or to the second. Yes, I did say second. Sometimes you have to plan out lessons to the second in grad school. Uh, One thing I hated doing was teaching something that I wasn't overly familiar with because there were the possibilities existed that I wasn't super sure what I was going to say, and by being silent, I might panic, I might sweat, I might think, oh my god, what is the audience thinking, or in this case, what are the students thinking? Now, obviously, if you know intimately about your subject, you can talk probably for hours and hours about it. I've literally had discussions, and let's call them mini speeches, for hours and hours where I knew intimately what I was talking about. But then, if I was stumbling or reaching in the dark with something I didn't know as much about, it could get really awkward and can get really uncomfortable. So, anyways, sorry, long tangent. Back to the story I was talking about. I was asked to teach how to use quotes in an essay, and that was a pretty safe topic for me because obviously one of my big fortes as an English teacher, one of the things I like to focus on a lot, especially for the seniors, is writing essays. And I remember this because it was the most uncomfortable 30 seconds. Maybe not in my entire life, but a long time. I remember I had gone through a slide, and I remember a teacher asked me a question in the room because there were a couple of teachers observing me. I remember a teacher asked me a question in the room. It was some obscure grammar question, and frankly, I knew it when they asked me, but I blanked. I blanked so hard, and I just thought, oh man, I don't remember the answer to this. And while I was thinking about it, I got really, really uncomfortable and I started to sweat and it felt like I was standing up there for an hour and looking stupid. Now, in all honesty, I think I blanked for 20 seconds. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but even if you think about it for a second, even if you really stop for 20 seconds in a speech, that's a long time, unless you intentionally mean to have that silence for something. And eventually the teacher asking the question took pity on me, and she gave me an easy out. It was like, maybe it's like this. I'm like, yes, it's like that. I seized upon the opportunity. So that's why a lot of people fear silence, because it makes us look weak or unable to control the flow of the speech. But silence can be really good. Silence can work super effectively by controlling the energy of your audience or by sort of setting the mood. Believe it or not, I have used it several times this year, actually, silence in public speaking. Not so much in our class, more in English. Those of you who are my juniors will know what I'm talking about, but I think last year's seniors, or rather last year's juniors, know what I'm talking about too. There have been a couple different classes where I wouldn't say anything to start off. I would simply stop and I'd look at you and I'd wait. I'd put my hands behind my back. And then a couple of you might catch on and look at me and say, "Oh, he's waiting for us," because he's not doing something on his own. Because he's staring, he's stopping, he's not doing anything. He's looking at us. That's all he's doing. All right. So not doing something is actually technically doing something. Some of you might have noticed that when I start off a lesson this way, I might cock my head slightly. I might tilt my chin up, which means, I have a pose with my face and my neck and the angle of what I'm doing with my head. I'm looking a little inquisitive. I might raise my eyebrow. I might look down a little bit, and you know that I'm expecting something. You know that I'm not super happy, but I'm not angry either. I'm just kind of waiting, and I have started more than a few lessons by simply doing nothing except look and tilt my head and wait. That's very effective. Now, obviously, outside of just openings, silences can provide a little bit of suspense or tension or lead up to anticipation, depending on how long you pause, which is really important, by the way. You don't want to pause too long. I can't imagine you would ever do this, but don't pause for like a minute or two when you start a speech. I would probably leave pauses in speeches around 5-10 seconds. If you're doing an exercise that requires silence, use as much time as you think you need, like 30 seconds, a minute, or something like that. But if you start a speech with silence, either keep it short, or if you're, for example, using silence to get everyone to quiet down, use it as long as you need to. Now, on the flip side of silence is obviously using energy and volume. Starting a speech, not necessarily by screaming. Well, then you can start a speech by screaming. We're talking confident or powerful energy. Sometimes it can be combined with saying something very effective, but other times it can just be normal stuff very loud. So, for example, I have started a couple lessons by saying, all right, guys, much louder than that. I don't want to wake up my roommate right now because it's kind of early. But yeah, volume can work very well to start a speech. Now, for the best openings with volume, say something that is enhanced by loud volume. So, man, I'm really bad with some of this stuff. So, with Martin Luther King Jr., he started off his one of his famous speeches by saying, "I have a dream," and he said it, projecting and loud and confident and strong. Obviously, he probably had a microphone, but strength, energy, volume. That's very important. Also, again, because I want to make sure I touch upon this too, you could start off a speech rather than just being silent. You could say something quiet. You could say something simple. But if you start off a speech with a quiet statement, the content of what you're saying has to be really strong. These things work really well with well-written openings. They're, if anything, as opposed to the last two, they're enhancers rather than being able to stand on their own. Just please keep that in mind. Okay, so some of the stuff, with the exception of volume, obviously, some of the stuff I've mentioned today can be applied conceptually to essays. However, I will say this. Unless you have a phenomenal, we're talking like the best kind of opening ever, please, 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 and I cannot emphasize this enough, please, 9 out of 10 times, do not start an essay with a quote. Unless it is specifically required for you to do so. I might talk about this in class later on. However, this does not apply to starting a speech. Sometimes, starting a speech with quotes can be absurdly effective. And frankly, it's one of the most common ways to start a speech. Usually when you quote something to start a speech, it should be relevant to the topic. Obviously, that just needs to make sense. But there are two ways to do this. There are two methods of quoting that are really, really good. First, quoting statistics is very effective. Using numbers or data can be really strong because it shows that you are well informed. It shows that you are intellectual, that you are learned in the subject. It presents you as an authority figure or kind of an expert. So, for example, if we're talking about dolphins, I'm pulling random topics out, I apologize, and I said something along the lines of 9 out of 10 scientists agree that dolphins are amongst the smartest animals in the world. So here I present two things. I present a number, I present 9 out of 10. I tell you it's coming from doctors, so I'm giving you some source, but a vague source. If I wanted to go a specific source, I could do that too. And I'm giving you some kind of general idea or comparison with dolphins. I'm giving you something to compare against. I'm saying they're among the smartest in the world, or maybe I could say they are the smartest in the world. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't know that much about dolphins, so don't use what I'm saying. Here's the quote when it comes to dolphins. But presenting a well-informed quote or statistic can really help present you as equally well-informed. Now, on the flip side, if we're talking not about so much statistics or data or info, you might want to say something a little more conceptual, a little more theoretical. Ideally, it's to still match up with what you're saying, but this version of the technique has a different effect, and I'll demonstrate this. One of my favorite quotes is loosely. It goes like this: true superiority does not come from comparing yourself to someone else. True superiority comes from comparing yourself to who you used to be. Now, I adore this quote. I really, really love it. And I am not the only one who really likes this quote. It is a phenomenal, fascinating quote. And I have heard some speeches start out this way, and it works very, very, very well. Now, if you pull obscure quotes out and somehow connect them to your speech, it presents you as someone who's smart or intelligent. You might be worldly. You might be cultured. You might have a lot of experiences. You might be kind of artsy, depending on what kind of quote you use. You could quote people who are more well-known, like Bon Jovi or Einstein. Or you could quote obscure figures who, despite being obscure, have really profound or interesting or awesome or heck funny things to say. It can be really, really good. So quoting works very well in starting speeches. All right, so the fifth technique I'm going to go over today, we've touched upon it before, but I want to officially talk about it, is using a story to start a speech. We've seen examples of this in class. I may have even used examples. I've literally taught you how to use this as a way to start essays. But getting down to the brass tacks over here, using a story to start a speech is extremely effective. It's personal, it can be emotional, and it definitely engages people. If you want to remember that in an easy way, think P-E-E, P. Yes, silly, dumb, I know, but it's easy enough to remember, P. Okay, so obviously, if you tell a story, it presents you as someone who is capable of showing the audience that they're a person. It shows that you're potentially vulnerable because you're choosing as a speaker to share something about yourself. Now, the sad part is you can obviously lie and make something up, but for the best results, I recommend you use a story that either happened to you or happened to someone you know, or use a real story but tweak some of the details. That might be fine too. Depending on what kind of story you use, you can elicit certain emotions. Obviously, funny emotions work really, really well. A lot of great speeches start with funny, even if the speech itself is not meant to be funny. This is very important. Even if the speech is not meant to be funny, you could start funny and then transition to sad or serious or somber or angry. Sometimes it helps if, for example, your speech is meant to elicit an emotion from your audience, and a very severe emotion. Sometimes putting your audience and having them go through an emotional roller coaster can get them where you want to get them. And obviously engaging. We are people who like to hear and visualize, so if you add details, for sure that's good. You want to make sure you're not picking a long story, but it should be a good story. So I want to provide you with an example. Let's say I'm giving a speech on, oh gosh. See, that's the tough part. It's the coming up with hypotheticals on the spot that's hurting me right now. All right, so let's think. Let's say I'm giving a speech about, let's say I'm giving a speech about college stress. This is a good one. Hang on, I'm sorry. My bird is chirping. It's the morning. Birds chirp in the morning. For those of you who don't really know, very, very loudly and frequently. So in any case, when I graduated college, I did a little. Man, that's really distracting. I'm very sorry. Okay, when I graduated from college, I sat down and I thought about how many energy drinks I'd consumed over the course of 5 years, this being 4 years undergrad and 1 year graduate level. I thought about all the Mountain Dew kickstarts I drank. I thought about the amps. I thought about all the monsters. I thought about all the bangs, and I thought, you know what? I can probably do the math. I'm gonna sit down and figure out how many energy drinks I've had over the course of 5 years. Now, my math isn't completely perfect. Frankly, I'm an English teacher. Math is not my forte. But if I did the math correctly, I roughly estimate that over the course of 5 years, I drank about 135 energy drinks. That's 135 Mountain Dew kickstarts, or monsters, or amps, you name it. Interestingly enough, I did not actually drink coffee in college. Frankly, I've never actually had a cup of coffee. And then so on and so forth. I probably linked in my speech at this point. But starting with the story, I did a couple different things. I presented myself as someone who shared a moment of vulnerability, but at the same time, I told you a little bit about myself. I told you I've gone to college. I've told you I've been to grad school and undergrad. I've told you it took me 5 years to get there. I told you that I'm an English teacher. I did all this stuff without meaning to get into that stuff. I had a goal for the story, but the story can do more than just get you where you want to go. Sometimes it can also provide personal information. Because if you're an engaging speaker, your audience might want to know more about you. And that's fine. Now, in terms of emotion, I'm sure some of you might have... well, this is interesting, actually, because I've told this story to a couple of people, and I've had some people, gawk at me and be like, oh my god, 135 energy drinks, that's crazy. Oh my god, man, like how are you still alive? Like, how are your veins not flowing with energy drinks? Honestly, I don't know sometimes. And interestingly enough, I've had a different emotion where it's kind of like, oh, it's cute, only 135 energy drinks. And frankly, that's terrifying to think that there are people out there who have even more unhealthy college caffeine stories than I do. That is actually horrifying now that I'm really thinking about it. But regardless, you can create emotions. Now, if I wanted to keep it straight and silly, I could use the silliness I get from talking about the 135 energy drinks and ramp it up. Or if I was getting a little more serious, I might, once I start with this relatively chipper story, I might drop to a more somber tone. I might talk about, while this was pretty funny, not only is my case very indicative of a lot of college students, mine's not even the worst one. And then I can get more serious from there. It really depends on what direction you want to go. And lastly, engaging through details is really, really important. I don't know if you guys realize this, but I took time during my opening story to talk about the different kinds of energy drinks. I talked about Mountain Dew kickstarts. I talked about amps. I talked about monsters. Similar to what I told you guys about making things up. Try not to do this too much, honestly, but making things up. I've never actually had the energy drink Bang in college before. Well, right, just I've never had it before this year. But I did remember while I was telling this story, oh shoot, is 3 enough? I don't think 3 is enough. I'm gonna add a 4th. So I added Bang because I had tried it this year. I also threw in a couple of numerical details. I talked about 135. I talked about 5 years. I told you there might be a little error on my part. Now, all 3 of these things, when combined, can make a really good story, and as a result, can make a really good opening technique. You just have to be careful that whatever you're doing with the technique for the story, it needs to be relevant. It needs to connect. You also don't want to run the risk of making a story that's too engaging. Because I've definitely seen people give speeches with their opening technique with using a story. People are like, yeah, I'm really into it. But then they set too high of a bar for themselves. They don't maintain the level, or they don't capitalize on the level. They just start really high. Then the speech is kind of boring, and then people peter out. You don't want to do that. You have to be very, very careful. Okay, so I've touched upon these things a little bit as I've gone through the lesson, but just some important disclaimers before I get to the assignment for this lesson. These things can be used together, they can be used independently, they can be used in combinations, or you might not want to use any of them. Sometimes, as much as I've told you some of the best presentations and speeches I've seen don't feel like speeches or presentations, sometimes it helps if you're just direct and simple and get straight to the point. not always, and frankly, less than using a technique, but sometimes it's distracting, and you don't want to be distracting. So gauge what's best for you. Length is really important, and opening should not take up the majority of your speech. I talked about make sure in terms of engaging this, don't start off too high, but don't start off too low. Make sure it's relatively consistent with how engaging your speech is, generally speaking. And connection and purpose. If your opening is really good, but it doesn't connect to what you're talking about, if you can't say after preparing your speech and justify yourself saying, is this really important? Don't include it. Or if there's no reason for you to do it, or no good reason, don't include it. Openings work best when they have something to do with your speech. Okay, so for the assignment for this lesson, here's what I want you to do. I have included 3 short scenarios. I haven't put too many details because if you want to fill in details on your own, I'll let you do that. But I wrote 3 hypothetical scenarios, and I want you to pick one of the 3 scenarios, and I want you to use one of the techniques I talked about today, at least one. You can use more than one if you want. I want you to use one of the techniques I taught you today, and then I want you to write or describe how you would use that technique in that scenario. So if you're running for class president, I mentioned the one where I saw someone rip up their speech. Please do me a favor and do not do that one for obvious reasons. But if you want to use scenario 1 in a different technique or use physicality in a different way, totally fine. Just don't use the rip up your speech scenario or the toss over your shoulder scenario. Scenario 2, you are defending yourself in court for a crime you did not commit. Whatever crime that is, I'll let you decide. Whatever court that is, I'll let you decide. And also let you decide the defending background, because believe it or not, if some of you didn't know, a lot of people strongly advise that you do not represent yourself in court because you don't have legal training or you might not know how things work. But some people do it anyways, and some people are very good at it. I'll let you decide if you want to pick that scenario. And scenario 3, you are selling something to a group of people. Obviously, what you're selling or what group it is or who you are, that's entirely based on you. Again, I'll let you fill in the details yourself. This does correlate to what we're going to do next marking period, since I'm going to talk about selling stuff that marking period as well. So pick one of these 3 scenarios, pick at least one of the 5 techniques I've covered. You can combine some of the techniques or you can just use one, that's up to you, and describe it. This will be in Classroom. I'm going to release that at the same time as the link to this video on Classroom. All right. Thank you. If you guys have any questions about the lesson, please let me know. And I hope you guys enjoy your spring break. And the next time we quote unquote meet, it'll be the next marking period, and we're going to talk about closings.